The thunder cracked so hard the windows of the diner shook in their frames, and every light in the place flickered once, twice, then held. Rain came down in sheets against the glass, blurring the parking lot into smears of red and white. Inside, forks stopped moving. A child near the counter started to cry, and Diesel, 78 pounds of Belgian Malinois, a dog who had cleared buildings under live fire without so much as flinching, was on his feet, trembling. Master Chief Ray Callahan felt his stomach drop. In 8 years, he had never seen this dog afraid of anything. Not gunfire, not helicopters, not the low percussive thud of mortars. But now, Diesel had pulled to the end of his leash, ears pinned, a low sound rising in his throat, and he was straining, not toward the door, not away from the storm, but across the room, toward the waitress. The gray-haired woman refilling coffee near table 9 had gone completely still, the pot suspended over a stranger's cup, her knuckles white around the handle. She was staring at the dog, and the dog was staring at her like he had found something he'd lost. "Diesel," Ray said low. "Heel." The dog did not obey. He had never once, in his entire working life, ignored that command. Ray stood, chair scraping, and the whole diner turned to watch this enormous animal drag his handler 2 tables forward, and then stop, dead stop, in front of the waitress. And then Diesel did something that emptied all the air out of Ray Callahan's chest. He sat. He lifted one paw, and he laid it, gently, against the woman's shin, the exact posture of a soldier reporting to someone he'd been taught, long ago, to protect. Ray froze. Because he had seen that posture before, he had trained it into dogs himself, and it did not mean scared. It meant found. Before we begin, wherever you're watching from tonight, whether it's a kitchen in Ohio or a quiet room in another country entirely, I want you to do something for me. Take a second and subscribe. This channel is for the quiet ones, the people who carry the heaviest things and never once ask you to notice. The ones we walk past every day without knowing. If you believe those people deserve to be seen, stay with me, because this story is about exactly that. Now, let's go back to before the storm. The diner was called Sue's, though there had been no Sue in it for a decade, and it sat off a 2-lane highway outside Beaufort, South Carolina, close enough to the base that half the regulars came in, still smelling of diesel fuel and salt water. It had a long counter with cracked red stools, a pie case that hummed, and a hand-lettered sign by the register that read, "We close when we're done, not when the clock says." Margaret Doyle had worked the closing shift there for 2 years. She was 61, or told people she was, and she moved through the place with an economy that nobody thought twice about. She never wrote down an order. She could carry 4 plates up one arm and a coffee pot in the other hand, and never spill a drop, even when the floor was wet, even when the young cooks were slammed and shouting. She wiped down tables in a pattern, always left to right, always the far edge first. And if you watched her long enough, which nobody ever did, you'd notice she always sat with her back to the wall on her break, always faced the door, and always knew exactly how many people were in the room without appearing to count. The other waitresses liked her because she was calm. When the ice machine flooded, when a trucker got loud, when a kid spiked a fever at table 4, Margaret's voice dropped lower instead of rising, and somehow that steadied everyone. "You've got a way about you," the owner Dale told her once. "Like nothing rattles you." "Plenty rattles me," she'd said, and smiled, and refilled the sugar caddies. She lived alone in the rented single wide with a porch she'd screened in herself. She kept a garden that mostly failed. She read paperback westerns and fell asleep with the lamp on. She did not have a television. She did not have many photographs on her walls. And the few she had were turned face down in a drawer, not hung. At 3:45 each afternoon, she parked her old Corolla in the same spot at the edge of the lot. At 4:40, she tied on her apron. At 6:10, she'd start the dinner regulars, the tired ones, the lonely ones, the couples who didn't talk anymore but still came for the meatloaf. She kept peppermints in her apron pocket and gave them to children and to old men who looked like they hadn't been given anything small and kind in a long while. It was a life built to be quiet, built, deliberately, to be small. But before that shift ended, the secret she had carried across 2 wars and buried under 2 years of apron strings and coffee refills was going to walk in out of the rain on 4 legs, and it was going to find her. Here's what the diner did not know about the woman refilling their coffee. Margaret Doyle was not her first name in the way it sounded. It was her middle name and her mother's maiden name. chosen off a form 2 years back because it was true enough not to feel like lying and false enough to disappear behind. Before Suze, before Beaufort, she had been Staff Sergeant Margaret Ellery, United States Army, and for 19 years she had been one of the finest combat medics the service ever quietly produced. She had done 3 tours. She had knelt in dirt that turned to mud under men who were bleeding out, and she had brought a shocking number of them home. She had a way with the dying and the nearly dying, a low, steady voice, hands that didn't shake. The trick of telling a 19-year-old with a hole in him that he was going to be fine in a tone so certain that his body half believed it and held on until the bird came. And for a stretch of those years, she had been attached to a canine unit. That was the part almost nobody knew, because the Army didn't advertise where it put its best people. She had learned the dogs. She had learned their commands, their tells, their language, the flick of an ear, the freeze before a hit, the particular way a well-trained working dog would report to a handler it trusted. She had patched those dogs up when they took shrapnel meant for the men. She had held one while it died, in a plywood room in a country she was told never to name, and she had never fully gotten over the sound it made. She hid all of it now for a reason that was simple and hard. She had come home the last time and found that the war had come home in her, too. The noise of it lived behind her eyes. She'd lost people, a whole team, in one bad afternoon, and she'd been the one who lived, the one who'd carried the folded flag to more doorsteps than a person should have to. Somewhere in there she decided she couldn't be Sergeant Ellery anymore. Sergeant Ellery was the woman everyone leaned on and nobody caught. Sergeant Ellery was expected to be strong at every funeral, so she let that woman go. She'd taken the middle name and the small town and the closing shift, and she'd built herself a life with edges. She could see a life where the biggest emergency was a flooded ice machine, where nobody needed her to be brave, where nobody knew. That was the deal she'd made with herself. Stay small, stay quiet, let it stay buried. She had kept that deal for 2 years and 11 days. The storm rolled in around 8 that night, ahead of the forecast, the way South Carolina storms do, all at once, mean and sudden. The dinner rush had thinned. There was the elderly couple at table 9, the Hendersons, who split a slice of pecan pie every Thursday. There was a trucker at the counter nursing coffee. And then, at 10 to 9, the doors swung open with a gust of wet wind, and 4 men came in from the rain, and a dog came in with them. Margaret noticed the dog before she noticed the men. She always would. He was a Malinois dark, muzzled, lean and hard-working dog, and not a pet. You could tell by the way he came through the door scanning low and deliberate, not sniffing at the floor for scraps, but reading the room corner to corner the way a soldier does. He wore a vest. He moved on a short lead beside a big man with a graying high and tight and forearms like braided rope. The men were veterans. She knew that too, before a word was spoken, not from the haircuts, from the small things, the way they took the corner booth without discussing it, the way the big one put his back to the wall, the way all 4 of them, without seeming to, clocked the exits. Table for 4. The big man said, and the dog stays. He's a service animal. I've got the paperwork if. He's fine, Margaret said. He can have the corner. Out of the walkway. She brought them water. She brought Diesel a stainless bowl she filled at the tap, and she set it down slow and off to the side, not reaching over him, not into his space. The way you set water down for a working dog, and not the way most people do it. The big man noticed. He didn't say anything, but his eyes flicked up at her for a half-second longer than they needed to. They ordered. She wrote nothing down. She brought it all back correct. And then the small things started. The men were talking low, the way old friends do, and it drifted to her in pieces as she worked the counter. They'd been at a funeral that afternoon. That was why they were dressed the way they were. Dark shirts, damp from the rain. One of their own had been buried. A man they kept calling by a nickname, Doc. In the soft way you say a name that still hurts to say. They come here after because they couldn't stand to go home yet. Margaret set 5 glasses on their table without thinking about it. 5. There were 4 men. She caught herself with the 5th glass already down and her hand still on it, and for a second she couldn't figure out why she'd done it. Old habit. You set a place for the one who isn't there. She started to lift it back. Leave it, the big man said quietly. She looked at him. We'd set it ourselves, he said. If you hadn't. And something moved behind his eyes. She left the 5th glass. Then came the second small thing. Thunder had begun to roll in off the coast, and with the first real crack of it, Diesel lifted his head. Ray put a hand down without looking. "Easy," he murmured, but the dog wasn't watching the window. Margaret saw it even from across the room. The dog wasn't tracking the storm. His ears had turned, not toward the noise, but toward her, toward the sound of her voice as she said, "More coffee, hone?" to the trucker at the counter. She felt it land on her like a hand on the back of the neck. She turned away and busied herself with the pie case. The third thing was the recipe. One of the younger men had pulled something from his wallet. A folded square of paper, soft with handling, and he set it on the table and smoothed it flat. "Doc's cornbread," he said, and his voice cracked right down the middle. "His wife gave us all a copy at the service. Said he'd have wanted us to have it." The others went quiet. "He used to make it in a coffee can," the young man said, "over a burner, in the middle of nowhere. Said it reminded him of his grandmother." Margaret Doyle stood very still by the pie case, and the coffee pot in her hand began, very faintly, to shake. "I want to stop here for just a moment, because something is about to happen in this room that I think most of us get wrong every single day." 4 men and a dog walked into a diner soaked and grieving, and to nearly everyone in that place, they were just late customers making a mess of the corner booth. Nobody looked twice. Nobody wondered what they were carrying. And the woman pouring their coffee, a tired lady in an apron with peppermints in her pocket. She was invisible too. We do this constantly. We decide who someone is in half a second, and we are almost always wrong. If you believe we should never judge a person by how they look, by the uniform they're not wearing, by the apron or the years on their face, then do me a favor and write "never judge" in the comments right now. I read them. Let's fill that space with people who still see people. Now, back to the diner, where a dog was about to do something no one could explain. The storm broke wide open a little after 9. The power flickered. The child at the counter began to cry, and Diesel came up off the floor. He didn't bark. That was the thing Ray would try to describe later, and fail to. The dog didn't bark or lunge or panic. He rose slow and certain, and he pulled to the end of his lead, not toward the door, not away from the thunder, but out across the room, toward the gray-haired waitress who had gone rigid by the pie case with a coffee pot trembling in her hand. "Diesel." Ray's voice, firm. "Heel." Nothing. The dog took another step, dragging Ray's arm straight. Every head in the diner had turned now. Ray stood, embarrassed, ready to apologize, ready to haul the animal back. And then Diesel crossed to the last 2 tables, stopped directly in front of Margaret Doyle, sat, lifted one paw, and laid it against her shin, and Ray Callahan went cold all over. Because that was not fear. He had trained dogs for 11 years, and he knew every posture a frightened dog could take, and this was none of them. This was a report. This was the posture a dog is taught to make in front of a specific person. A medic, a handler, a member of the team. A signal that says, "I have you. I am with you. I am on station." You did not get that from a dog by accident. You got it from months of a particular person, working with a particular dog, in a particular unit. Ray looked up at the waitress's face. She had gone the color of paper. "Ma'am," he said slowly, and the whole room was silent except the rain. "How do you know my dog?" "I don't," she said. But she hadn't moved, and her free hand had come down, without her deciding it, to rest on Diesel's head, and the dog leaned into it and closed his eyes. And Ray watched that, and his own face began to change. "You've done that before," he said. "That's not how a stranger touches a working dog. You went to the shoulder. You waited for him." He set his own water glass down very carefully. "Who are you?" "I'm just the waitress," Margaret said. Her voice was steady. Her hand was not. And then the big man at the corner booth, the young one, the one with the recipe, stood up so fast his chair fell over. His name was Kyle, and he was 26, and he had buried his father figure that afternoon, and grief had made him raw and mean the way it does to the young who haven't learned yet where to put it. "Don't," he said, and his voice was shaking. "Don't do that. Don't stand there and pet his dog like you know something. My whole life just got put in the ground today. So if this is some game, some show," he was breathing hard, "how does that dog know you? Answer him. How?" The diner had gone dead quiet. Dale had come out from the back. The Hendersons had stopped mid-bite. Rain hammered the roof. "Sit down, Kyle," Ray said low. "No." Kyle's eyes were wet and furious. I want to know. People don't just, dogs don't just. His voice broke completely. Doc's gone. You understand? He's gone, and I don't get to ask him anything ever again, and now this dog is. He couldn't finish. He jabbed a finger toward Margaret. Who are you to make him do that? And Margaret Doyle, who had built 2 years and 11 days of silence, looked at the grieving boy, and something in her gave way. Not loudly, quietly, the way a dam doesn't so much break as decide, at last, that it is tired of holding. She set the coffee pot down on the nearest table. Coffee can, she said. Kyle stopped. Your Doc, she said, very softly. He made his cornbread in a number 10 coffee can, over a single burner, and he burned the bottom every single time, and he called that the best part. And he'd cut you the burned corner first because he said the new guys had to earn the good pieces. She paused. He kept the recipe folded in his left breast pocket, behind his tags, so it'd be close to the heart. He used to say that. Nobody breathed. How? Kyle's voice was a whisper now. How could you possibly? Because I taught him to keep it there, Margaret said. In a plywood room. In a place I'm still not supposed to name. Because a pocket over the heart is the one place you check first on a man who's down. And I told him, if he was ever hit, I wanted to find that paper and know he made it that far, still being himself. Her chin trembled once and steadied. His name was David Reyes. We called him Doc because he could stitch a man up nearly as fast as I could. And I was the one who taught him how. The recipe on the table. The 5 glasses. The dog's paw on her shin. Ray Callahan sat down slowly in a chair that wasn't his. You were his medic, he said. I was his sergeant, Margaret said. Staff Sergeant Margaret said. Staff Sergeant Margaret Ellery, 60th. I had that dog. She looked down at Diesel, and her hand tightened in his fur. When he was 18 months old, and dumb as a fence post, and scared of the dark. Before he was yours. His name was Diesel then too. We didn't change it because he'd finally learned it. A sound came out of her that was half laugh, half something breaking. I taught him that paw. I taught him to report to the medic. I taught him that in a war none of you were old enough to be in. The storm went on outside, but inside the diner the only sound for a long moment was the rain and the hum of the pie case. Ray Callahan found his voice first. I got Diesel 3 years ago, he said. Transfer from another unit. His paperwork had a gap in it. A handler listed and then blacked out. I always wondered. He looked at her. That was you. That was me, Margaret said. And then it came out of her. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one landing like a stone dropped in still water. Because she had held it so long that once it began to move, it could not be stopped. And the boy Kyle sank back into his chair and listened with his mouth open and tears running unhidden down his face. She told them about the 68th. She told them about David Reyes, 19 years old, a kid from El Paso who'd shown up to her aid station so green he flinched at his own rifle, and how she'd taken him under, because she saw something steady underneath the fear, how she'd trained him up, how he'd become the best she had, the one who ran toward it, the one who stayed calm when the calm ran out of everyone else, how she'd been the one to promote him in the field, with a marker on the back of his hand because there was no paper. She told them about the afternoon it all went wrong. She did not give them the details of it. There are details that aren't for a diner. She only said that it was bad, and that she had worked on more men than a person has hands for, and that Diesel, this dog, this exact dog now pressed against her leg, had lain across a wounded man's chest to keep him from thrashing while she worked, and had taken a piece of shrapnel in the shoulder doing it, and had not moved, not once, until she told him he could. He carries it still, she said. There's a scar under the vest. Left shoulder. You felt it. Ray reached down, slid his fingers under the edge of the vest without a word, and found it. The old ridge of it. He closed his eyes. She told them David Reyes had made it home. That was the part that surprised them. They thought this was going toward a battlefield death, and it wasn't. He'd come home. He'd married. He'd had a daughter, and the war had followed him the way it followed everyone in that room. And she'd lost touch with him the way you lose touch with the people who remind you of the worst day of your life. Because sometimes love and memory get tangled up, and you can't hold the one without the other. When did he pass? Ray asked gently. Today, Margaret said. You told me today. At his funeral. The one I didn't know about. Her voice finally cracked all the way through. "I didn't know he was gone until you four walked in with his cornbread in your wallet. I've been pouring coffee in this town for 2 years, 40 minutes from where they buried him, and I didn't know. And that was the thing that undid her. Not the war, not the memory, but that she had made herself so small and so quiet and so hidden that she had missed her own chance to say goodbye to the boy she'd raised into a soldier. And it had taken a dog, trembling in a thunderstorm, refusing every command he'd ever been given, to walk across a room and find her and put a paw on her shin and say in the only language he had, 'I remember you. I remember. You are not as invisible as you think.'" Kyle got up out of his chair. He came around the table slowly, this big grieving boy, and he stood in front of the woman he'd shouted at 5 minutes before, and he didn't know what to do with his hands. "He talked about you," Kyle said. "Doc did. He never used her name. I think he couldn't. But there was a sergeant. He said everything he knew he learned from a sergeant who could keep a man alive by arguing with him, who'd tell you weren't allowed to die because she hadn't given permission." A wet laugh. "We thought he made you up. We thought you were a story." "I'm not a story," Margaret said. "No, man," Kyle said. "You're not." And then he did the thing that broke the whole room open. He turned back to the table, and he picked up the 5th glass, the one she'd set down without thinking, the one they told her to leave, and he carried it to her, and he pressed it into her hands. "We set a place for him," Kyle said. "Every time. An empty seat, a glass, so he's still at the table." His throat worked. "But you're not empty. You're here. So this one's yours now, if you'll take it. If you'll sit with us." Margaret Doyle looked at the glass in her hands. Dale, from over by the register, said quietly, "Take your break, Margaret. Take the whole night. Diner's on me." She untied her apron with hands that had stopped shaking. She laid it over the back of a chair, and she sat down in the corner booth with 4 strangers who were not strangers, and Diesel folded himself down across her feet with a groan of an old soldier finally standing down, and put his chin on her boot, and did not move for the rest of the night. Not for the thunder. Not for anything. They talked until the storm passed. They pulled out the recipe and read it aloud. Ray called the base and told them he'd be late and didn't explain why. And at some point near midnight, Margaret took a peppermint from her apron pocket out of pure habit and set it in front of Kyle without a word, the way she gave them to lonely old men and crying children. And Kyle looked at it and laughed until he cried. Because it was such a small thing, and because David Reyes used to carry the exact same peppermints in the exact same way, and none of them had ever known where he'd learned it. Now they did. It was nearly a year later, the following spring, that Ray Callahan came back to the diner off the 2-lane highway outside Beaufort. He came on a Thursday because he'd learned that was the Hendersons' pie night, and the place had a certain gentleness on Thursdays. He brought Diesel, who was retired now. Ray had put in the paperwork himself, and the dog lived with him full-time and slept on a bed nearly as big as Ray's own. And he brought a small flat package wrapped in brown paper. Margaret still worked the closing shift, but she wasn't hiding anymore. There was a new photograph on the wall by the register now, among the local pictures, and Dale had hung it himself and refused to let her turn it face down. It showed a young man in fatigues, grinning, holding a coffee can up to the camera like a trophy, and beside him, a dark-muzzled dog, and behind them both, half out of frame, a younger woman with sergeant stripes, laughing at something outside the picture. Someone had written along the bottom in careful marker, "Doc's cornbread. Best part's the burned corner." Margaret came up from the kitchen, wiping her hands, and when she saw Ray, she smiled. A real one, the kind she used to keep locked away, and Diesel's whole back end started going at the sight of her, and he crossed the floor and put his paw on her shin. And this time, the diner didn't go silent. This time, 3 regulars just smiled, because they knew the story now. Everyone in that town knew the story now. "Brought you something," Ray said. He set the brown paper package on the counter. She opened it slowly. Inside was a patch, worn, faded, frayed at one edge, the unit patch of the 68th, the one she'd stripped off 2 years ago and thought she'd thrown away. "Kyle had it," Ray said. "Doc kept it. It was in a box his wife gave the boys. There was a note with it." He slid a small folded paper across. "It's yours." She unfolded it. It was in a handwriting she knew as well as her own. A young man's block letters gone shaky with the years. "If you ever find her," it said, "tell Sergeant Ellery I kept the paper over my heart the whole time, just like she taught me. Tell her she kept me alive so I could have a life. Tell her that burnt corner was always for her. Margaret Doyle stood behind her own counter, in her own apron, in her own small good life, and she pressed that worn patch to her chest over her heart, in the one place you check first on a person who's down. And for the first time in a very long time, she let someone see her cry, and it was not the crying of a dam breaking. It was the other kind. The kind that comes not because grief has disappeared, but because it has finally been shared. The storm that had brought them all together was a year gone, but the table in the corner still gets set for 5 on Thursdays. There's a glass and a chair, and sometimes a slice of cornbread with the corner burned dark on purpose. And an old dog sleeps under that table with his chin on a waitress's boot, not scared of anything anymore, not thunder, not the dark, because he found who he was looking for, and he never lost her again. If this story reached the place in you that remembers the quiet ones, the people who carry the whole weight of it and never ask you to notice, the ones who set a place at the table for those they've lost, then subscribe and stay with us. This channel is where we go looking for them, one story at a time, until every last one of them gets found. Thank you for sitting at the table tonight. There's always a chair for you here.